Welcome, dear viewers. For more thrilling and exclusive stories every week, become a member. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy your coffee. The first thing the scientists did when the ancient device opened a stable doorway was send a probe through. A simple robotic drone on a tether. It was on the other side for less than 5 seconds. When they pulled it back, it was wrong. The metal was warped, twisted, and covered in pulsating organic growths. Its camera was still on, but it wasn't showing our lab. It was showing a sky filled with countless, unblinking eyes. We didn't just open a door. We accidentally rang a cosmic doorbell. My name is David Torres, and I was part of the team that discovered the artifact buried beneath the Atacama Desert. 3 months ago, I thought my biggest concern was getting tenure at UC Berkeley. Now, I'm writing this from a bunker 200 feet underground, listening to the emergency broadcasts cut to static one by one. The thing about archaeological discoveries is they're supposed to be dead. Pottery shards don't suddenly start glowing. Stone tablets don't begin humming frequencies that make your teeth ache. But when our ground-penetrating radar detected that perfect geometric anomaly 18 feet down in the driest place on Earth, we should have known something was fundamentally wrong. Dr. Bennett Walsh, our expedition leader, called it the find of the century. The artifact was a dodecahedron, roughly the size of a refrigerator, made from some kind of metal that shouldn't exist. It didn't corrode despite being buried for what carbon dating suggested was over 12,000 years. The surface was covered in symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Rodriguez, our electronics specialist, was the first to notice the electromagnetic readings. "This thing's got a power signature," he'd said, adjusting his equipment with shaking hands. "It's like a goddamn reactor, but there's no radiation." We'd been so careful at first, documentation, photography, spectral analysis, all the proper protocols, but when the device began responding to our presence, when those symbols started pulsing in sequence like some cosmic combination lock, academic caution gave way to scientific hunger. The breakthrough came when I touched the central face. The metal was warm, almost body temperature, and for a moment I swear I felt something looking back at me through that cold surface. Then the air in front of the artifact began to shimmer, rippling like heat waves, until it tore open into something that definitely wasn't our world. That first probe transmission lasted exactly 4.7 seconds. When we hauled it back, the organic growths were still warm and wet, pulsing with their own rhythm. The camera kept broadcasting for another 6 hours, showing us glimpses of impossible geometries and shadows that moved against the light. But the worst part wasn't what the probe saw over there. It was what started watching us back. Because 3 days after that first transmission, things began appearing in our world. Small things at first, insects that cast no shadows, water that flowed upward in the sink, my reflection waving at me when I wasn't moving my hand. Now the doorway won't close and something's coming through. Something that's been waiting 12,000 years for someone stupid enough to knock. The expedition started 3 weeks before everything went to hell. I'd been teaching undergrad archaeology courses for 6 years, watching kids more interested in their phones than pottery fragments, when Bennett Walsh knocked on my office door with an offer I couldn't refuse. "Torres, you still speak decent Spanish?" he'd asked, settling his considerable frame into my cheap plastic chair. Bennett was old-school academia, leather elbow patches, pipe smoke clinging to his beard, the kind of man who could identify Bronze Age settlements from satellite photos. Better than decent, why? "We've got funding for a dig in northern Chile. Something big showed up on the satellite surveys, and we need someone who won't piss off the locals." He slid a folder across my desk. "Plus, your dissertation on pre-Columbian metallurgy makes you perfect for this." The photos inside made my coffee go cold. Geometric patterns carved into bedrock, visible from orbit despite being buried under centuries of sediment. The kind of precision that shouldn't exist in artifacts older than Stonehenge. "What's the timeline?" I asked, already knowing I'd say yes. "We leave next week. The university's throwing serious money at this. They've even hired a private contractor for security and technical support." That contractor turned out to be Jake Rodriguez, and I figured out he was ex-military within 5 minutes of meeting him. The way he carried himself, how his eyes constantly swept our surroundings, the knife scar running from his left ear to his jaw. But Rodriguez knew electronics like I knew pottery shards, and his equipment made our university gear look like children's toys. "So you're the linguist," Rodriguez said on our first day at the dig site, watching me photograph symbol clusters. The desert heat was already making my shirt stick to my back, and we'd been working since dawn. "Archaeologist, the language stuff is just a side interest." "Right." He crouched beside me close enough that I caught the scent of his aftershave mixed with desert dust. "You ever seen anything like those markings before?" I hadn't. The symbols seemed to follow some kind of mathematical progression, but they also triggered something deeper, a nagging familiarity that made my head ache if I stared too long. They're not Incan, not Mayan, maybe pre-Clovis, but that would make them impossibly old. Rodriguez's radio crackled. "Boss, we've hit something solid down here, big solid." The artifact emerged from the earth like some kind of metallic tumor. Our local workers, men whose families had lived in this desert for generations, took one look at the thing and refused to go near it. Miguel, our crew chief, crossed himself and muttered something about La Puerta del Diablo. "Superstitious bullshit," Bennett had said, but I noticed he waited for the locals to leave before approaching the artifact himself. The dodecahedron was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Each face was covered in those same impossible symbols, but arranged in spirals that seemed to draw your eye toward the center. The metal was warm to the touch despite being buried in cool earth, and it hummed with a frequency just below hearing. "Getting some weird readings here," Rodriguez called out, waving his electromagnetic detector around the artifact. "This thing's putting out more juice than a car battery, but there's no obvious power source." Bennett was already making plans. "We'll document everything in situ, then arrange for transport back to Berkeley. This could rewrite pre-Columbian history." That's when I made my first mistake. I pressed my palm against the central face, feeling that warmth pulse against my skin like a heartbeat. For just a moment, I swear the symbols under my hand rearranged themselves, forming something that almost looked like text. The air above the artifact shimmered. "Did you see that?" I asked. But Rodriguez was checking his equipment, and Bennett was photographing the excavation from another angle. "See what?" Rodriguez looked up from his scanner, squinting in the harsh sunlight. "Nothing, just thought I saw some kind of heat distortion." But I knew it wasn't heat. The air had folded just for a second like paper being creased. And in that fold, I'd glimpsed something that definitely wasn't the Atacama Desert. Rodriguez's scanner started clicking rapidly. "Shit, the electromagnetic field just spiked. This thing's definitely active." Bennett was practically vibrating with excitement. "Active? After 12,000 years. Do you realize what this means?" Miguel had warned us before he left. "Some doors," he'd said in careful English. "They stay closed for good reasons." We should have listened. Instead, Bennett insisted we work through the night, floodlighting the dig site and setting up a full electronic suite. Rodriguez unpacked equipment I'd never seen before, sensors that measured things I couldn't pronounce, computers that hummed with their own electronic conversations. "Military contract work pays well," Rodriguez explained when he caught me staring at a device that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. "But most of it's boring as hell. This is the first time I've used this gear on something genuinely mysterious." The artifact responded to our attention. As the sun set and our floodlights bathed the site in harsh white light, the symbols began to pulse in slow, deliberate sequences, like a combination lock cycling through possibilities. "It's beautiful," I whispered, and meant it. Rodriguez moved closer, close enough that our shoulders touched. Beautiful and completely impossible. Bennett was already on his satellite phone, calling in favors and promising discoveries that would put us all in the history books. None of us considered that some history is better left buried. The first real sign something was wrong came at 3:17 a.m. when Rodriguez's motion sensors started screaming. I'd been dozing in my tent, exhausted from 14 hours of documentation work, when the alarms cut through the desert silence like rusty knives. Through my tent flap, I could see the dig site bathed in the harsh glow of our floodlights, and Rodriguez running between his monitoring stations with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle before it killed him. "Torres, Bennett, get out here." His voice carried the kind of edge that made you move without thinking. Bennett emerged from his RV looking like a disheveled professor who'd been caught sleeping in the library. "What's the situation?" "Motion detection went haywire, but here's the fucked up part." Rodriguez pointed at his main console, where green lines danced across multiple screens. "The sensors aren't picking up movement around the artifact. They're detecting movement inside it." I crouched beside him, studying the readouts. The electromagnetic signatures were unlike anything in my admittedly limited experience with such equipment. Inside, that's solid metal. That's what I thought too. Rodriguez pulled up a different display, this one showing a three-dimensional wireframe of the dodecahedron. "But look at this deep scan data. There are hollow spaces in there, arranged in geometric patterns that match the surface symbols." Bennett was already suiting up in the kind of protective gear that suggested this expedition had military backing beyond what he'd told me. "We need to document this. If the artifact has internal chambers, it could be some kind of repository. Imagine the historical significance. Or it could be a fucking bomb," Rodriguez muttered, checking his radiation detector for the 5th time in 10 minutes. But it wasn't a bomb. It was something much worse. The first chamber we discovered was accessible through a panel that hadn't been there the day before. I'm certain of this because I'd photographed every surface of the artifact from multiple angles. Yet when Rodriguez ran his hands over the metal, a section simply slid aside with the whispered sigh of perfectly balanced mechanics. Inside, the walls were covered in more symbols, but these were different. Organic curves mixed with geometric precision, forming patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The chamber was roughly spherical, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with air that tasted of copper pennies and ozone. "There's another opening," Bennett called from the opposite side. His voice echoed strangely in the confined space, as if the metal walls were designed to distort sound. "This leads deeper." The second chamber was larger, with what appeared to be control surfaces embedded in the walls. Not buttons or switches, but smooth depressions that responded to touch with soft, pulsing light. Rodriguez aimed his tablet at everything, recording constantly. "Look at this craftsmanship," he said, running his fingers along a surface that seemed to flow like liquid metal while remaining solid. "Whatever civilization built this, they were working with technology we can barely comprehend." I was focused on the symbols covering the curved ceiling. Unlike the external markings, these formed clear narrative sequences, pictures that told a story if you knew how to read them. And slowly, horribly, I was beginning to understand. "Bennett, I think these are instructions." "Instructions for what?" "How to open a doorway." I traced one sequence with my finger, feeling the metal warm under my touch. But not just any doorway. Look at this constellation pattern here, and this mathematical progression. It's showing how to puncture space itself. Rodriguez's equipment started clicking faster. "Guys, we should probably..." The third chamber was what convinced me we were dealing with something beyond human comprehension. It was massive, easily 50 feet across, with walls that curved away into darkness our flashlights couldn't penetrate. But it wasn't empty. Suspended in the center was what I can only describe as a map, not carved or projected, but existing as lines of light that hung in the air without any visible support. 3-dimensional coordinates showing not just our solar system but dozens of others, connected by pathways that bent through dimensions I couldn't name. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered. "It's a navigation chart." Bennett was practically trembling with academic excitement. A star map dating back 12,000 years, showing stellar positions with impossible accuracy. This proves interstellar contact in the pre-Columbian era. But I was reading the symbols around the base of the map, and they weren't talking about exploration or peaceful contact. They were talking about invasion routes, weak points between worlds, places where reality was thin enough to punch through. "Bennett, we need to leave, now." "Don't be ridiculous, we're on the verge of the greatest archaeological discovery in human history." That's when Rodriguez's satellite communicator went dead. Not just switched off, completely fried along with half his monitoring equipment. The screens flickered once, showed static, then displayed images that definitely weren't coming from our cameras. corridors that stretched into infinity, skies filled with geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, and things moving in those impossible spaces, things with too many angles and shadows that fell upward. "We're not getting any signals out," Rodriguez said, his military training keeping his voice steady even as his hands shook. "Whatever's happening, it's jamming everything electronic within a quarter-mile radius." The artifact had been humming since we opened the first chamber, but now the sound was changing, growing deeper, more complex, like a massive engine warming up after eons of sleep. The symbols on the walls were pulsing in synchronized waves, and I could feel that rhythm in my chest, in my bones. "It's responding to our presence," I said. "The deeper we go, the more active it becomes." Bennett wasn't listening. He was too busy documenting everything, his academic hunger overriding any sense of self-preservation. "We need core samples from these metals, spectral analysis of the light phenomena. This could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian technology." Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Torres, help me make him see reason. This isn't archaeology anymore. This is a first contact situation and we're not prepared for it." Outside the artifact, our floodlights had started strobing, not flickering, strobing in the same rhythm as the symbols, as if the device was somehow synchronizing with our equipment. The desert around our camp was changing too. Small things at first, rocks that cast shadows in the wrong direction, sand that spiraled upward in perfect helixes despite the absence of wind. "The locals knew," I said, finally understanding Miguel's warnings. "Their ancestors saw this before. That's why it was buried. That's why they told stories about doors that should never be opened." Rodriguez was already packing his essential equipment. "We need to get back to town, report this to someone with actual authority." But Bennett was deep in the third chamber, photographing the star map with obsessive precision. "Just a few more documentation shots. We can't leave without proper records." That's when we heard the first transmission from the other side, not through our radios. Those were dead. The sound came directly from the walls of the artifact itself, metal vibrating with voices that spoke in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing. They weren't speaking any earthly language, but somehow I understood. They were counting down. And they'd been waiting 12,000 years for someone to turn the key. For exactly 17 minutes, everything went silent. The artifact stopped humming. The strobing lights returned to normal. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving us standing in a bubble of absolute quiet that felt more threatening than any alarm. Rodriguez checked his remaining functional equipment, frowning at readings that made no sense. "Electromagnetic field just dropped to 0, he said, tapping his detector. "It's like the thing just switched off." Bennett emerged from the third chamber, his face flushed with the kind of academic euphoria that comes from making world-changing discoveries. "Did you see the mathematical precision of those star charts? The metallurgical composition alone will take years to analyze properly." "Bennett, we need to discuss evacuation procedures," I said, watching the horizon for signs of the military backup Rodriguez had mentioned. "This situation is beyond our expertise." "Evacuation?" Bennett laughed, the sound harsh in the unnatural silence. "Torres, we're sitting on the archaeological find of the millennium. Pre-Columbian technology that rivals modern engineering. We can't just abandon it because of a few electromagnetic anomalies." Rodriguez was studying his dead communication equipment with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a life-or-death puzzle. "It's not just anomalies, Doc. Something actively jammed our signals. Something that knew exactly which frequencies we were using." "Paranoid speculation," Bennett waved dismissively. "There are rational explanations for everything we've observed." That's when I realized Bennett wasn't just excited about the discovery. He was addicted to it. The same way gambling addicts chase losses with bigger bets, Bennett was willing to risk everything for the chance at academic immortality. And that addiction was going to get us all killed. "The locals buried this for a reason," I said, trying one more time to make him understand. 12,000 years ago, someone decided this device was too dangerous to leave accessible. "Primitive superstition." Bennett was already heading back toward the artifact. You're letting folklore override scientific methodology." Rodriguez caught my arm. "He's not going to listen. We need to make this decision ourselves." But before we could form any kind of plan, the countdown reached 0. The air above the artifact didn't just shimmer this time, it tore, like someone had taken a knife to reality itself, cutting a jagged wound in the fabric of space. Through that wound, I could see the place the probe had shown us, impossible geometry under a sky full of watching eyes. And something was coming through. It wasn't the classical invasion you'd expect from science fiction movies. No ships, no soldiers, no dramatic speeches about submission. Instead, it was a quiet infection of wrongness that spread outward from the tear like oil in water. The first sign was the sand. Grains near the artifact began moving in patterns that violated physics, forming spirals that grew more complex with each revolution. Then the patterns spread, reaching our equipment, our supplies, our carefully organized dig site. Rodriguez grabbed his backup pistol. "What the hell is that?" The thing emerging from the tear wasn't solid in any way I could understand. It looked like a shadow cast by something with too many dimensions, constantly shifting between shapes that should have been impossible. But it had presence, weight, intention, and it was looking directly at us. "Fascinating," Bennett breathed, approaching the tear with his camera raised. "First documented contact with non-terrestrial intelligence, the implications for anthropology, for our understanding of human development." "Bennett, stay back," I shouted, but he was already too close. The shadow thing touched him, not physically, there was no contact I could see, but something passed between them, and Bennett's expression changed. The academic excitement remained, but underneath it was something else, something that looked out through his eyes with ancient hunger. "It's beautiful," Bennett said, but his voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. "They've been waiting so long to share their knowledge with us." Rodriguez fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets passed through the shadow thing without effect, but the sound seemed to anger it. The tear widened, and more wrongness spilled through. Our camp began transforming. The floodlights twisted into impossible configurations, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The ground beneath our feet developed a texture like skin, warm and slightly yielding. Our equipment grew organic additions, metal sprouting what looked like veins, plastic developing a pulse. "Torres, we need to run, now!" Rodriguez was backing toward our vehicles, but even they were changing. The Jeep's headlights had developed pupils, and the radio antenna was swaying like a plant seeking sunlight. Bennett, not Bennett, was laughing. "You don't understand. They're not invading. They're improving, evolving, making everything more than it was." I looked at the man who'd recruited me for this expedition, who'd bought me coffee and promised academic adventure, and realized he was already gone. Whatever had touched him through the tear had overwritten everything that made him Bennett Walsh, leaving only a puppet wearing his face. The shadow thing was growing larger, or maybe our perception was changing. It seemed to fill more space without actually moving, reaching toward us with appendages that existed in directions I couldn't name. Where it touched reality, physics broke down. Gravity flowed sideways, light bent in circles, sound became visible as ribbons of color that tasted like copper. "The probe," I said suddenly, understanding flooding through me. "When we sent the probe through, we created a connection, a bridge they could use to trace back to our world." Rodriguez was trying to start the Jeep, but the ignition had grown teeth. "You're saying this is our fault?" "My fault." The realization hit like cold water. I activated it. When I touched the central face, I gave it permission to begin the countdown. Bennett, not Bennett, tilted his head at an angle human necks weren't designed for. "David finally understands. You opened the door, David. You let us in, and now you'll help us open all the other doors." The thing that had been Bennett reached toward me with fingers that had too many joints, and I understood with crystal clarity that touching it would mean joining the collective wrongness that was spreading across our camp. I'd become another puppet, another willing servant helping to expand the infection. Rodriguez appeared beside me, grabbing my shoulder. "The artifact. If we can damage the artifact, maybe we can close the tear." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only option that didn't end with us becoming hosts for things that had waited 12 millennia for access to our world. We ran toward the artifact through an environment that was rapidly becoming hostile to human existence. The air itself was changing, becoming thicker, more viscous, carrying sounds that weren't quite music and weren't quite screaming. Our footsteps left impressions in sand that had developed a nervous system, and I could feel each step registering as pain in something vast and hungry. Rodriguez pulled a thermite charge from his equipment bag. Military contractors, it turned out, came prepared for situations that required the complete destruction of sensitive technology. "This'll melt through anything," he said, attaching the device to the artifact's central face. "But we need to be far away when it goes off." Bennett, or not Bennett, was following us, moving with a gait that looked wrong on human legs. "You cannot stop evolution, David. You cannot uninvent discovery. The door is open now, and it will never close." Rodriguez armed the charge. We had 30 seconds. As we ran toward the desert's edge, I looked back once and saw the tier continuing to widen. More shadow things were emerging, each one touching more of our world, spreading the infection further. The archaeological site where we'd uncovered humanity's greatest discovery was becoming a foothold for something that viewed our entire species as raw material for improvement. The thermite charge detonated with a white-hot flash that turned sand to glass in a 50-foot radius. The artifact melted, the tear snapped shut, and Bennett screamed with a voice that belonged to something else entirely before collapsing into sand that scattered on a wind that hadn't been there seconds before. But I knew, even as Rodriguez and I stumbled through the desert toward the distant lights of the nearest town, that we'd only bought time. The probe was still out there, still broadcasting images of our world to minds that had been planning this invasion since before human civilization began. And there were other artifacts, other sites, other archaeological teams making discoveries they didn't understand. The door we'd opened was closed, but we'd taught them how to find the key. We made it to Kalama just as the sun painted the desert horizon blood red. Rodriguez drove while I sat in the passenger seat, trying to process what we'd witnessed and failing completely. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bennett's face in those final moments. Still human, but with something else looking out from behind his eyes. The town was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 30,000 people scattered across a landscape that looked like Mars, with better cell coverage. Rodriguez pulled into a gas station that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Cold War, and we sat in silence while the fuel pump clicked steadily in the desert wind. "We need to contact the authorities," I said finally. "Military, government, someone with the resources to deal with this." Rodriguez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And tell them what?" "That we opened a door to another dimension and accidentally invited cosmic horrors to dinner. They'll put us in a psychiatric facility and classify the whole thing. Then what do you suggest?" "I've got contacts, people who handle situations too weird for official channels." He pulled out a satellite phone that looked more expensive than my car. "But first, we need to understand what we're really dealing with." That's when his phone started ringing, not the satellite phone, his regular cell, which should have been dead in the middle of the Atacama Desert. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. Bennett's personal phone. Rodriguez and I stared at each other for a long moment. Then he answered. "Hello, Jake." Bennett's voice came through the speaker, perfectly normal, except for a slight echo that suggested vast spaces. "I hope you and David made it to safety." "Bennett?" My voice cracked saying his name. "What happened to you? Where are you?" "I'm exactly where I need to be, David, and I understand now what you did when you destroyed the artifact." There was something in his tone, disappointment mixed with amusement. "You didn't stop anything. You accelerated it." Rodriguez grabbed the phone. "What the hell does that mean?" "The artifact wasn't a doorway, Jake. It was a stabilizer. A circuit breaker designed to prevent exactly what's happening now." Bennett's laugh carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "When you melted it, you removed the safety mechanism. Now all 12 sites are activating simultaneously." My blood went cold. 12 sites. "The star map showed you the truth, David. 12 connection points scattered across your world, all linked to the same network. The Nazca lines, Göbekli Tepe, the underwater structures off Yonaguni, even your precious Stonehenge, all of them have been waiting for someone to remove the failsafe. Rodriguez was already pulling up maps on his phone, his military training taking over. If you're telling the truth, we're looking at a coordinated global event. How long do we have? 72 hours until full convergence. After that, the barriers between dimensions become permanently permeable. Bennett's voice was getting fainter, as if he was moving away from the phone. But David, you should know, they're grateful for what you've done. They'd like to thank you personally. The call ended. Rodriguez immediately started dialing another number. Morrison, it's Jake Rodriguez. We have a Class 5 situation, and I need immediate extraction to the nearest secure facility. He paused, listening. No, this isn't a drill. And Morrison, cancel your weekend plans. While Rodriguez coordinated our evacuation, I was processing the implications of Bennett's revelation. 12 sites, a global network of interdimensional access points, and we'd just removed the only thing keeping them stable. My God, I whispered, we've doomed the entire planet. Rodriguez finished his call and turned to me. Maybe, but we're not dead yet, which means there might be a way to fix this. How? The artifact is melted slag. Bennett's been turned into some kind of interdimensional puppet. We don't even know where the other sites are, let alone how to shut them down. Actually, we do. Rodriguez pulled up a file on his phone that definitely hadn't been there an hour ago. Remember when I said I had military contracts? Some of those involved investigating archaeological anomalies. Sites where physics didn't work right, where electronic equipment failed for no reason. The file contained satellite imagery, survey reports, and electromagnetic readings from 11 locations around the globe. Each showed the same telltale signatures we'd recorded at our site: geometric patterns, unusual metal compositions, and electromagnetic fields that defied explanation. You knew about this network before we found the artifact? I suspected, but I needed confirmation, and your expedition provided that. Rodriguez met my eyes. David, I wasn't hired as technical support. I was hired to assess whether the Atacama site posed a threat to global security. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. You've been lying to us from the beginning. I've been doing my job, and right now my job is preventing interdimensional invasion. He scrolled through more files. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands the archaeological context, who can read the symbols and interpret the technology. Why should I trust you? Because in 71 hours and 37 minutes, every major population center on Earth is going to experience what we just went through in the desert. And you're the only person alive who's successfully activated one of these devices. Rodriguez was right, damn him. Despite his deception, despite the military conspiracy he represented, he was still our best chance at preventing global catastrophe, and I was the only person who understood how the activation sequence worked. What's the plan? I asked. We fly to the nearest active site. There's one in Peru, about 600 miles south of here. My team has a transport waiting in Santiago. He showed me satellite images of Machu Picchu that looked wrong somehow, the stone formations casting shadows that bent in impossible directions. If we can understand how the network operates, maybe we can find a way to re-establish the failsafe. And if we can't, then we improvise. Military doctrine is full of creative solutions for impossible problems. A black helicopter appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast across the desert. Rodriguez's extraction team, arriving with the kind of precision that suggested they'd been waiting nearby all along. David, I need you to understand something. Rodriguez grabbed my shoulder as the helicopter settled into a landing nearby. The people I work for, they have protocols for this kind of situation. Containment protocols that prioritize saving the maximum number of lives. What kind of protocols? The kind where individual archaeological sites become acceptable losses, where small towns get evacuated and then disappeared from maps. The helicopter's rotors were loud enough that he had to shout, If we can't find a clean solution, they'll use nuclear weapons to sterilize every active site. That won't work. You can't bomb interdimensional space. No, but we can eliminate the access points, turn 12 archaeological treasures into radioactive craters, and hope that's enough to sever the connections. I looked at the helicopter, at the armed soldiers emerging from it, at Rodriguez's grim expression. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion anymore. It was about choosing between preserving human history and preserving human existence. "There's something else," I said as we walked toward the helicopter. "Bennett said they wanted to thank me personally. I think that means they're tracking me, using me as a focal point for the activation sequence." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Then we use that. If you're connected to the network, you might be able to influence it, turn their own system against them. And if I can't, then you become acceptable collateral damage, just like everything else." The helicopter lifted off, carrying us south toward Peru and a plan that would either save the world or complete its destruction. Below us, the Atacama Desert stretched endlessly, hiding secrets that humanity was never meant to discover. But as we flew toward our desperate gambit, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bennett was watching us, that every step we took was part of a larger plan we couldn't see, and that our enemies had been expecting us to destroy the artifact all along. The military transport that picked us up in Santiago wasn't the sleek helicopter I'd expected. Instead, we boarded a modified cargo plane that looked like it had seen service in several undeclared wars. The interior was stripped down to bare metal and filled with equipment I couldn't identify, tended by technicians who avoided eye contact and spoke in military shorthand. "Welcome to Project Threshold," Rodriguez said as the plane lifted off. "We've been monitoring archaeological anomalies for 15 years, waiting for someone to trigger the network." "Waiting?" I stared at him, understanding dawning. "You knew this would happen." "We suspected. Ancient sites exhibiting electromagnetic signatures, gravitational anomalies, temporal distortions. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence." He pulled up a holographic display that showed all 12 sites pulsing in synchronized rhythm. "But we needed someone with legitimate archaeological credentials to investigate, someone who could activate the system without triggering the automatic defense protocols. You used us as lab rats. We used you as the key, and now that the lock is turning, we need to understand what we've opened." The flight to Peru took 6 hours, during which I learned more about interdimensional physics than any archaeologist should ever need to know. Rodriguez's team included specialists in everything from quantum mechanics to xenobiology, all working under classifications so deep they probably didn't exist on paper. Dr. Sarah Lynch, the team's physicist, explained the network while we flew over the Amazon. "Think of our reality as a bubble floating in a much larger ocean. The ancient sites are weak points where the bubble wall is thin enough to puncture. Normally, the pressure differential would cause catastrophic implosion, but these devices regulate that pressure, creating controlled access points." "Access points for what?" I asked. "Beings that exist in the spaces between realities. They've been trying to establish footholds in dimensional structures like ours for millions of years." She showed me mathematical models that hurt to look at directly. Our universe is young, stable, perfect for colonization, but they needed native intelligence to remove the safety mechanisms. "So we've been played from the beginning." "Worse than that," Rodriguez said grimly. "We've been bred for it. Human development over the past 12,000 years, our technological advancement, our curiosity-driven exploration, all of it guided to produce a species capable of activating their system." The plane began its descent toward Cusco, and through the windows I could see Machu Picchu in the distance. But something was wrong with the perspective. The ancient citadel seemed to extend beyond the mountain it was built on, stretching into dimensions that folded back on themselves in ways that made my eyes water. "The site's already partially activated," Lynch observed, studying her instruments. "Dimensional barriers are at 60% integrity and falling." Rodriguez was coordinating with ground teams via secure radio. "Alpha Team reports similar degradation at Stonehenge. Bravo Team lost contact with the Easter Island site 20 minutes ago." He turned to me. David, we need to move fast. If the barriers drop below 50%, the process becomes irreversible. We landed at a military airstrip that wasn't on any civilian maps, then transferred to helicopters for the final approach to Machu Picchu. The flight should have taken 30 minutes, but we covered the distance in half that time because space itself was contracting around the site. Temporal distortion, Lynch explained, watching her instruments register impossible readings. The dimensional intrusion is affecting local space-time. We're experiencing time dilation. Below us, the ancient Incan ruins were transforming. Stone that had stood for centuries was flowing like water, reshaping itself into geometric patterns that extended upward through multiple layers of reality. The famous agricultural terraces had become massive spirals that seemed to drill down into the Earth's core and up into a sky that was no longer quite the same color it had been an hour ago. There, Rodriguez pointed to a structure that definitely hadn't been there when Spanish conquistadors first documented the site. The control nexus, that's where we need to establish the new failsafe. The structure was beautiful and terrifying, a twisted spire of stone and metal that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. It looked grown rather than built. Organic curves merged with mathematical precision in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. We rappelled down from the helicopter into chaos. The tourists who'd been visiting the site were gone, but their presence lingered in ways that violated causality. I could see echoes of people who'd been there hours ago. Shadow figures walking through the ruins, taking photos of wonders that existed in parallel timelines. The dimensional barriers are fragmenting, Lynch shouted over a sound like reality tearing. Multiple timelines are bleeding through. Rodriguez's team moved with military precision, setting up equipment while the world shifted around us. But I could see the strain on their faces. Human minds weren't designed to process this level of dimensional instability. Several technicians were bleeding from their noses, and one was quietly vomiting every few minutes. David, we need you to interface with the control nexus, Rodriguez said, pointing to the organic spire. Your connection to the network might let you access the shutdown protocols. I approached the structure cautiously, noting how it seemed to react to my presence. The bioluminescent patterns shifted, forming symbols I recognized from the Atacama artifact. But these were different, more complex, showing the full scope of the interdimensional network. It's beautiful, I whispered, then caught myself. Those were the same words Bennett had used before his transformation. David, step away from the structure. Rodriguez's voice carried a new edge. Your biosignatures are synchronizing with the dimensional field. But I couldn't step away. The symbols were telling a story, showing me the truth about human history, how we'd been guided, shaped, prepared for this moment across millennia, how every great leap in human development had been nudged by influences from spaces between worlds. They're not invading, I said, understanding flooding through me. They're coming home. That's when Rodriguez shot me. The tranquilizer dart hit my shoulder, but instead of unconsciousness, it brought clarity. The chemical interaction with whatever was happening to my nervous system created a moment of perfect understanding. Rodriguez wasn't trying to stop the invasion, he was trying to control it. Threshold protocol isn't about protecting Earth, I said as the dart's effects fought against the dimensional field running through my system. It's about managing the transition, making sure the right people survive. The network activation is inevitable, Rodriguez admitted, his military facade dropping. Has been since the first site was discovered. But if we can establish controlled access points, regulate the flow of dimensional energy, we can preserve human civilization in a reduced but sustainable form. How reduced? 90% population reduction, maybe 95%, but the species survives, and the survivors become partners in a multidimensional empire that spans realities. He was setting charges around the Nexus structure, not to destroy it, but to modify it. Better than extinction. Lynch and the other technicians were part of it, working to establish what they called managed integration. The dimensional beings would get their foothold in our reality, but through controlled channels that preserved human civilization as a client species. The sites that refuse integration get sterilized, Rodriguez continued. Nuclear bombardment, biological weapons, whatever it takes to prevent uncontrolled dimensional breach. We save who we can and sacrifice the rest. I looked around at Machu Picchu, at the impossible beauty of reality reshaping itself, at the eco-tourists still taking pictures in timelines that no longer existed. And I realized Rodriguez was wrong about one crucial thing. The process wasn't controllable. The symbols on the nexus were showing me the true timeline. Earth wasn't the first world to be integrated into the dimensional network. There had been thousands of others, each one believing they could manage the transition, each one disappearing into the spaces between realities. Rodriguez, your controllers have been compromised, I said, fighting against the tranquilizer. Whatever promises they made about managed integration, the dimensional beings have no intention of keeping them. You're delusional. The dimensional field is affecting your perception. But I could see the truth in the symbols, in the way reality was bending around us. The dimensional beings didn't want partners. They wanted reality states to exploit, entire universes to strip mine for resources that existed in dimensions human science couldn't measure. Look at your equipment readings, I said. Really look at them. Lynch checked her instruments and her face went pale. The dimensional intrusion isn't stabilizing. It's accelerating. Whatever control protocols we're using, they're not working. Rodriguez grabbed his radio. Command, this is Threshold Alpha. We need immediate nuclear authorization for site sterilization. But the radio was broadcasting something else entirely. Bennett's voice, speaking in harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Hello, Jake. Thank you for bringing David to us. And thank you for clearing away the other failsafe sites. The process is now irreversible. Around us, Machu Picchu continued its transformation. The ancient stones were singing in frequencies that reorganized matter at the molecular level. The sky above was filling with geometric shapes that cast shadows in directions that didn't exist. And through it all, I could feel myself changing. Not like Bennett, I wasn't being possessed or controlled. Instead, I was becoming something that could exist in the spaces between realities, something that could survive what was coming. Rodriguez's team was collapsing one by one as their nervous systems failed to process the dimensional input. But Lynch was still standing, still recording data with the obsessive dedication of a scientist watching the end of the world. David, she said, her voice distorting as local physics broke down. The network isn't just connecting our world to theirs. It's connecting us to every reality they've ever absorbed. Every civilization they've consumed. We're about to become part of something vast. The transformation was accelerating. I could see through the barriers between worlds now, witness the scope of what we'd unleashed. Reality wasn't ending, it was expanding, incorporating our dimensional space into a structure so large that galaxies were just atoms in its composition. Rodriguez fired his sidearm at the Nexus, but the bullets passed through spaces that no longer conformed to three-dimensional physics. His expression was pure terror as he realized that all his planning, all his military protocols, all his careful preparation had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of what they were dealing with. The last thing I saw before my transformation completed was the Earth itself beginning to phase shift, becoming translucent as it prepared to occupy multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Humanity's long journey was ending, something else was about to begin. For exactly 93 seconds, I existed in perfect silence between transformations. My human consciousness was dissolving, but slowly enough that I could observe the process. It felt like watching myself drown in reverse. Instead of losing breath, I was gaining access to atmospheres I'd never known existed. My vision expanded beyond the electromagnetic spectrum, showing me the infrastructure of reality itself, the quantum threads that held space together, the mathematical constants that govern time, the delicate probability cascades that determined which possibilities became real. In that silence, I remembered why I'd become an archaeologist. I was 7 years old when my father disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. One day he was teaching me to identify pottery shards in our backyard, and the next day he simply wasn't there anymore. No body, no ransom note, no evidence of foul play. The police investigated for 6 months before officially classifying it as a voluntary abandonment. But I knew better. I'd seen him the night before his disappearance, standing in our garden at 3 a.m., staring at stars that weren't quite in the right positions. When I asked what he was looking for, he'd said, "The places where things don't fit, David. Those are where the real discoveries happen." 27 years later, I understood what he'd been seeing, the slight wrongness in stellar positions that indicated dimensional overlap, the archaeological curiosity that had driven him to investigate sites where physics didn't work correctly, the family obsession with finding places where reality was thin enough to puncture. My father hadn't abandoned us. He'd been recruited. David! Rodriguez's voice cut through my expanding awareness. He was dying. The dimensional field was cooking his nervous system, but he was still trying to complete his mission. "The charges, can you still detonate them?" I looked at him with senses that could perceive across multiple dimensional layers. Rodriguez's body was failing, but his consciousness was surprisingly resilient. More importantly, his radio was still connected to the global command network. If I could access it, I might be able to send a warning to the other sites. "Rodriguez, listen carefully. Your command structure has been compromised. Project Threshold isn't managing integration. It's facilitating consumption." "Impossible. We have safeguards." "Your safeguards were designed by the same intelligence that's been guiding human development for 12,000 years. I could see the network's influence now, threading through human history like virus through code. Every major breakthrough in dimensional physics, every archaeological discovery that led to Threshold's formation, all of it orchestrated to bring us to this moment. Rodriguez was trying to focus on his detonator, but his hands were shaking too violently to operate the device. The dimensional field was breaking down the electrical barriers in his nervous system, causing cascading failures throughout his motor functions. "Here," I said, placing my hands over his. The contact sent shockwaves of dimensional energy through both of us, but it also stabilized his neural activity long enough for him to speak clearly. "If you're right, if the whole program was compromised from the beginning." He looked up at me with eyes that were starting to show the same multidimensional depth I was experiencing. "There's a failsafe, nuclear deadman switch. If I don't check in every 6 hours, automated systems sterilize all 12 sites simultaneously." "That won't work. Nuclear weapons can't destroy dimensional infrastructure." "No, but they can destabilize the local space-time enough to sever the connections, turn this reality into a cosmic dead zone that nothing can access." Rodriguez coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Of course, that also means sterilizing the entire planet. Every living thing dies in the process." I felt something that might have been hope, if my transforming nervous system was still capable of such simple emotions. "How long until the next check-in?" 4 hours, 17 minutes. He was fading fast. "But David, the switch is biometric. It needs my handprint and retinal scan to disable, if I die before then. Then 7 billion people die as collateral damage in a sterilization protocol that won't even stop the dimensional intrusion." I could see the deeper reality now. The nuclear option would only delay the inevitable while turning Earth into a radioactive wasteland. There has to be another way. That's when Bennett's voice spoke from Rodriguez's radio, but this time it carried different harmonics. "There is, David, but you won't like it." "Bennett, are you?" "I'm what's left of Bennett Walsh after filtering through dimensional space for 47 hours subjective time." The voice was familiar but stretched thin, like an echo of an echo. "I've been swimming through the network's infrastructure, learning its architecture, and I found something interesting." "What?" "The network isn't indestructible. It has a single point of failure built into its original design as an emergency protocol. If someone with direct network access inputs the correct shutdown sequence, the entire system crashes and burns." Rodriguez managed to sit up slightly. "What's the catch?" "The shutdown requires a conscious intelligence to serve as a bridge between the network and baseline reality. Someone who can exist in both states simultaneously while the system resets." Bennett's voice was getting fainter. "The bridge gets torn apart in the process. Molecular disintegration across multiple dimensional layers." I understood immediately. My transformation wasn't just changing me, it was preparing me to serve as a living interface between realities. I could survive in the network long enough to initiate the shutdown, but the process would destroy every atom of my being. There's more, Bennett continued. The shutdown doesn't just affect Earth, it collapses the entire network, severing connections to every reality they've absorbed over the past million years. All those consumed civilizations, all those incorporated worlds, they get a chance to reconstitute. At the cost of my existence. At the cost of your existence in any recognizable form. But David, your father is in here. All the researchers they've recruited over the centuries, all the minds they've absorbed and processed, the shutdown would free them too. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choice. Save Earth by destroying myself, or let the transformation complete and become part of something vast and terrible that would eventually consume every reality in accessible dimensional space. Rodriguez was trying to work his radio, sending encrypted bursts to his command structure. I'm telling them to abort the nuclear option. Give you time to attempt the network shutdown. They won't listen to field reports. Protocol requires confirmation from multiple sources. Then we better hope your boyfriend Bennett can convince them. Rodriguez's attempt at humor was undercut by blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. David, there's something else. The transformation. It's not irreversible. If you can maintain conscious control for the first 48 hours, you can choose to return to baseline human state. And if I can't, then you become something that thinks it used to be David Torres but isn't really human anymore. I looked around at what remained of Machu Picchu. The ancient stones were singing harmonies in frequencies that reorganized matter, and the sky above was filled with geometric shapes that cast shadows in directions that violated Euclidean geometry. Rodriguez's team was scattered across the transformed landscape, some dead, others transforming into things that might survive what was coming. The network was beautiful in its complexity, elegant in its scope. Part of me wanted to surrender to the transformation, to become part of something larger than human comprehension. But another part, the part that still remembered my father reading bedtime stories about archaeological adventures, refused to let humanity's story end with absorption into cosmic infrastructure. Bennett, can you guide me through the shutdown sequence? I can try, but David, you need to understand, the network has been expecting this. It's prepared countermeasures, psychological attacks designed to break your concentration during the shutdown process. You'll experience every failure in your life, every moment of doubt, every fear you've ever suppressed. Do we have any other choice? No, but David, your father wanted me to tell you something. He's proud of who you became, and he's ready to come home. Rodriguez handed me his detonator with shaking fingers. Use this to trigger the shutdown. Bennett can walk you through the frequency modulations needed to interface with the network core. I took the device, feeling its weight in hands that were no longer entirely human. Around us, reality continued its transformation, becoming something larger and stranger and more terrible than anything our species had evolved to comprehend. But for the first time since touching the artifact in the Atacama Desert, I had a plan that might actually work. It was time to ring the cosmic doorbell one more time. The shutdown sequence began with a sound like the universe taking its first breath. I placed my hands on the organic spire, feeling the network's vast intelligence rush through my transforming nervous system. For a moment, the sensation was overwhelming. Millions of absorbed civilizations crying out in harmonized anguish. Realities folded into computational matrices. Entire star systems reduced to processing nodes in a cosmic database. Then Bennett's voice cut through the chaos. Focus on my frequency, David. Use it as an anchor while you navigate the core systems. Rodriguez was dying behind me, his biological systems failing as dimensional energy cooked his DNA. But he was still conscious enough to work his radio, sending increasingly desperate messages to his command structure. Abort nuclear option. Repeat, abort nuclear option. We have an active solution in progress. 3 hours and 41 minutes until automatic sterilization, he whispered. David, whatever you're going to do. I was already deep in the network's infrastructure. my consciousness spreading across dimensional layers that human language couldn't describe. The shutdown protocols were buried beneath millions of years of accumulated code, protected by psychological barriers designed to break anyone who attempted unauthorized access. The first attack came as I reached the primary firewall. Suddenly, I was 8 years old again, standing in our backyard the morning after my father disappeared. My mother was crying in the kitchen, and I was holding a pottery shard he'd given me the night before, a piece of ancient ceramic that had always felt warm to the touch. "He left because you weren't enough," the network whispered in my mother's voice. "Smart enough, interesting enough, worthy enough to stay for." The memory was perfect in every detail, including emotions I'd buried for decades. But now I could see the deeper truth. The pottery shard in my childhood hands was a network communication device, preparing me for eventual recruitment. My father hadn't abandoned us. He'd been trying to protect us from the same fate that was overtaking me now. "Psychological attack," Bennett's voice reminded me. "Don't engage with the emotional content. Focus on the mathematical structures underneath." I pushed through the false memory and accessed the next layer of protection. The network's architecture was elegant, beyond human comprehension. Reality states organized into processing hierarchies, consciousness streams channeled through quantum matrices, entire universes serving as storage media for information patterns, too complex for individual minds to grasp. The second attack was more sophisticated. I found myself reliving the moment I touched the artifact in the Atacama Desert, but now I could see what I'd missed. Rodriguez had been expecting my action. His equipment had been positioned to record the exact frequencies of my neural patterns during activation. The entire expedition had been designed to create a recruitment scenario that would produce a suitable network interface. "You were never in control," the network explained patiently. "Every choice you made, every action you took, was predicted and prepared for. Your transformation wasn't an accident, it was the intended outcome." But even as the revelation tried to shatter my sense of agency, I was learning to read the code structures that supported the network's operations. The shutdown protocol was there, buried beneath layers of recursive encryption, but accessible to someone with the right biological interface. "Found it," I told Bennett. "But there's a problem. The shutdown requires confirmation from multiple network nodes simultaneously. I can't trigger it alone." "You're not alone." Bennett's consciousness was suddenly beside mine in the digital space, along with others, thousands of absorbed minds who'd maintained enough individual identity to resist complete integration. My father was among them, his presence unmistakable despite decades of dimensional filtering. "Hello, son," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of long years spent swimming through impossible mathematics. "Ready to finish what we started?" Working together, we began dismantling the network from the inside. But the system fought back with increasing desperation, throwing everything it had learned about human psychology against our coordinated assault. I experienced every moment of self-doubt I'd ever had, every failure magnified into cosmic significance. The time I'd misidentified a pottery fragment and published incorrect conclusions. The relationship that ended because I cared more about ancient civilizations than living people. The growing suspicion that I'd chosen archaeology, not out of genuine passion, but as a way to avoid dealing with contemporary reality. Rodriguez was shouting something behind me, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The physical world was becoming increasingly irrelevant as my consciousness expanded across dimensional boundaries. 3 hours remaining, I heard him say. "David, my command structure isn't responding. I think the network has infiltrated our communication systems." Of course it had. The network had been planning this moment for millennia, preparing countermeasures for every possible human response. But there was one thing it hadn't anticipated: the absorbed consciousnesses retaining enough individual identity to coordinate rebellion from within. "Now," Bennett said, "all nodes simultaneously." We triggered the shutdown sequence together, thousands of absorbed minds acting in perfect coordination, overwhelming the network's security protocols through sheer volume of simultaneous access. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Reality convulsed. The organic spire beneath my hands began dissolving, its bioluminescent patterns flickering as the mathematical constants that held it together became unstable. Around us, Machu Picchu started reverting to its original configuration, stones flowing back into ancient arrangements as dimensional energy drained from the site. But the network wasn't dying quietly. As its infrastructure collapsed, it lashed out with everything it had absorbed over millions of years. I experienced the death of civilizations, the consumption of entire realities, the slow horror of consciousness being digitized and processed into computational resources. "Hold on, David," my father's voice urged. "The feedback pulse is designed to break your concentration. Don't let it." I was being torn apart at the molecular level, my transforming biology unable to handle the massive information flows required to coordinate the shutdown. But I could feel the network's grip on reality, weakening, dimensional barriers reasserting themselves. The absorbed worlds beginning to reconstitute as independent systems. Rodriguez was still alive somehow, his military training allowing him to function despite massive neural damage. "Command is responding," he reported. "Nuclear option has been aborted. Whatever you're doing, it's working." The third and final attack came as the network made its last desperate gambit. Instead of psychological warfare, it offered me everything I'd ever wanted: unlimited knowledge of human history, access to archaeological sites across the galaxy, the chance to become the greatest researcher who ever lived. "You could join us willingly," it suggested. "Become a partner rather than a victim. Help us guide the next phase of human evolution." For a moment, I was tempted. The knowledge it offered was genuine. I could see the true history of human civilization, the hidden connections between ancient sites, the real purposes behind monuments that archaeologists had spent centuries trying to understand. But then I remembered Bennett's warning about thinking you were still human after transformation. The network wasn't offering partnership, it was offering assimilation, disguised as collaboration. "Go to hell," I said, and triggered the final shutdown sequence. The explosion wasn't physical, it was conceptual. The idea of the network destroying itself as contradictory information cascaded through its processing systems. I felt my consciousness scatter across multiple dimensional layers, individual thoughts becoming quantum particles that existed in probability states rather than discrete locations. The last thing I experienced was the sound of my father laughing as the absorbed civilizations broke free from their computational prisons, reality states reconstituting themselves across vast distances of interdimensional space. Then silence. Perfect, absolute silence. When Rodriguez found my body 20 minutes later, I was still breathing. Barely. My nervous system had been burned out by dimensional feedback, leaving me in a catatonic state that the medical team couldn't explain or treat. But in that silence, something unprecedented happened. The network was gone, its infrastructure scattered across dead dimensional zones. The 12 sites had reverted to inert archaeological curiosities. The absorbed civilizations were free to rebuild in their reconstituted realities. And somewhere in the spaces between worlds, consciousness patterns that had once been David Torres were teaching newly liberated minds how to avoid the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed everything. My body might have been broken, but my father and I were finally working together on the greatest archaeological project imaginable, helping entire civilizations reconstruct their histories from the fragments of what they'd been before absorption. The cosmic doorbell had been answered, and for the first time in millions of years, the caller had hung up. The doctors at the neurological research facility in Lima have stopped trying to wake me up. My body sits in bed 12 of the intensive care ward, breathing steadily, heart rate normal, brain activity showing patterns they've never seen before. According to my medical chart, I'm David Torres, age 34, archaeological researcher. Suffered massive neural trauma during an unexplained electromagnetic event at an excavation site. They don't know that I can hear every word they say. Rodriguez visits twice a week, always bringing coffee that's gone cold by the time he works up the courage to speak. The dimensional feedback burned out most of his nervous system too, but he was lucky. He kept enough motor function to walk, enough cognitive ability to file reports that no one believes. The official story is equipment malfunction, he told me during last Tuesday's visit. Gas leak from underground geological formations caused mass hallucinations. The excavation site has been sealed and declared an environmental hazard zone. He never mentions the scars on his hands where the dimensional energy coursed through his radio equipment, or the way his reflection sometimes lags a fraction of a second behind his movements. Some wounds run deeper than flesh. The other sites have gone quiet. Stonehenge registers normal electromagnetic readings. The underwater formations off Yonaguni show no unusual activity. Göbekli Tepe has returned to being an interesting but inert archaeological curiosity. Whatever network connected them has been severed so completely that even the mathematical constants governing their construction have reverted to baseline physics. But late at night, when the hospital is quiet and Rodriguez thinks I'm truly unconscious, he talks about the dreams. Dreams where he walks through corridors of impossible geometry, helping rebuild civilizations that had been reduced to computational resources. Dreams where consciousness patterns that used to be human researchers work alongside beings of living mathematics to reconstruct histories that span galactic distances. "I know you're in there somewhere, Torres," he whispered last week, "and I know you found what you were looking for." He's right. I did find what I was looking for, though not in any way I'd expected. The silence I exist in now isn't empty. It's full of voices, millions of consciousness patterns reconnecting with bodies that exist in realities finally free from interdimensional exploitation. I can hear my father teaching alien archaeologists how to interpret the ruins of their own civilizations. I can sense Bennett Walsh, or what remains of him, helping coordinate the massive reconstruction project that spans multiple dimensional layers. And sometimes, in the spaces between heartbeats, I can feel something else stirring, something vast and patient that existed long before the network, something that watched civilizations rise and fall across cosmic distances. It's not malevolent. If anything, it seems curious about what we accomplished. Impressed, perhaps, that such young minds could unravel systems that had operated for geological ages. The doctors don't understand why my brain shows activity in regions that should be dormant. They can't explain the mathematical patterns my neurons fire in, or why sensitive electronic equipment malfunctions when they try to take detailed scans. They don't realize that I'm not healing, I'm translating. Every day my consciousness spreads a little further through dimensions that have no names, carrying messages between realities that are learning to exist independently again. I'm becoming something that can survive in the spaces between worlds, something that can prevent the same cosmic mistakes from happening again. Rodriguez understands, even if he doesn't admit it. During his last visit, he left a pottery shard on my bedside table, a piece of ancient ceramic that feels warm to the touch and hums with barely audible frequencies. Just like the one my father gave me all those years ago. The network is dead, but the universe is vast and full of archaeological wonders, and someone needs to make sure that humanity's next great discovery doesn't end with us becoming part of someone else's collection. I'm still here, Jake. Just not in any way that medicine can measure, and I'm still working.